One big takeaway from this brief is that Svalbard's unique status and strategic importance warrants special consideration from policymakers in Washington, D.C. And I think we highlight that the territory does not necessarily align with what is required from the rest of the European Arctic. Hi, I'm Otto Svendsen. I'm a research associate for the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program, and I'm here to talk about my recent brief, Arctic Geopolitics, the Svalbard Archipelago. So just to briefly recap what we did in this brief, I think it's important to start off by laying out what Svalbard is. Svalbard is a Norwegian archipelago located about 1,000 kilometers south of the North Pole. It's about twice the area of Belgium. And what's unique about Svalbard is that it has treaty-protected economic rights for foreign nationals and, again, certain treaty limitations on what the Norwegian government is allowed to do on this territory, specifically with regards to using the archipelago for warlike purposes. And the reason we decided to write this brief about Svalbard is that we wanted to add some nuance to an Arctic security debate that can often fall into overly broad or simplistic framings of great power politics. And by focusing on this very unique case study in the European Arctic, we wanted to highlight some of the areas where this framing is helpful and some of the areas and some of the ways where it is not. One big takeaway from this brief is that Svalbard's unique status and strategic importance warrants special consideration from policymakers in Washington, D.C. And I think we highlight that the territory does not necessarily align with what is required from the rest of the European Arctic. So in the rather unlikely event of a broader Russia-NATO conflict, Svalbard would be central to controlling access to and from the Atlantic Ocean by Russia's Northern Fleet, which houses its fleet of nuclear submarines on the Kola Peninsula. At the same time, the archipelago's unique status as the sovereign territory of Norway, but with treaty-protected economic rights for foreign nationals and limitations on what the Norwegian government is allowed to do with the territory from a defense planning perspective, really limits the tools available to Norwegian and NATO defense planners. In terms of how the brief relates to the broader policy discussion, I'd say that, first of all, Russia's presence on Svalbard highlights the difficulties of severing ties to Russia following its invasion of Ukraine, first in 2014, and later on with the full-scale invasion in 2022. And then I'd say a broader, more long-term point that we make in the brief is that Russian overtures to China can strengthen Beijing's claim at being a near-Arctic state, and this may also spill over into the North Atlantic region. We see this in particular with some of the close collaboration between the Russian and the Chinese Coast Guard agencies. To read the full brief, Arctic Geopolitics, the Svalbard Archipelago, please visit CSIS.org.